So last week we discussed one of the Separatist holdouts, which were a form of early rebellion against the Galactic Empire. Well, today I want to talk about the many rebellions that the Empire was facing basically from day one, and kind of discuss what would lead to the Rebel Alliance. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, I've talked a lot in several videos about how the galaxy was very accepting of the rise of the Galactic Empire, but that's not a universal sentiment. A lot of people were unhappy with the Galactic Empire and made their opposition to it known fairly quickly, some immediately from day one, and others within the first few years of Imperial reign. And this would sort of dominate Imperial military doctrine for the first 5 or 6 years of the reign of the Empire. So I figured now's a great time to discuss those early rebellions and what they mean for the existence of the Empire. So let's start with the obvious ones, Separatist holdouts, those who'd never stopped fighting the Clone Wars. Many of us forget that the Clone Wars actually were an ideological struggle between a sort of more centralized republic and a much looser confederacy made up of systems in the Outer Rim that would become the CIS. And people really believed these causes. Well, we know from a viewer's perspective that the CIS was always a puppet in Palpatine's plan. To the people of the galaxy, they were a legitimate political movement with die-hard supporters, many of whom could simply not accept defeat at the hands of the Republic when the war came to an end. Now, a lot of places simply had public demonstrations that were quickly put down by the Empire, but there were also quite a few places that took up arms, or reactivated the battle droids in their area and continued fighting. In a lot of places, the Clone Wars didn't end, like what we see on Desix, where a local government was able to reactivate the droid units on their planet and continue to fight against the new Galactic Empire. In most cases, though, these rebellions were relatively small, usually not necessarily supported by a planetary government, but instead their own sort of private entities, things like militia groups, mostly made up of organic soldiers and not battle droids. It's another thing that a lot of people seem to forget about the CIS is that it wasn't just an army of battle droids, it was backed up by an army of organic people native to the worlds under the CIS's control who genuinely believed in the Confederacy's ideals. So they kept fighting even after the droids around them shut down. And that's how we get these Separatist holdouts that would be so prominent in the early days. And they would end up being a great scapegoat for the Empire to point to say, hey, these guys want the CIS back, do you want more Clone Wars? To, the people of the galaxy. Obviously, we all want more Clone Wars. There were other forms of rebellion, though. One of the other ones that we see kicking off basically from day one is Saw Gerrera's partisans. Now, they were formed in support of the Republic during the Clone Wars to fight the CIS occupation of Onderon, and following the rise of the Empire, they would almost immediately pivot to being opposed to the Galactic Empire. This represents sort of the other form of rebellion that the Empire saw, starting at basically day one, were rebel movements against basically any form of oppression. It's likely that there were similar rebel movements on places like Ryloth, with strong independence movements that would oppose any totalitarian government coming in to take control of their world. So we see this on Onderon, on Ryloth, and likely many other places across the galaxy. This leads to small homegrown rebel cells with determined fighters fighting for their own home worlds, but as sort of scattered organizations. They're not really working together yet. So those are the two forms of rebellion that the Empire faced basically from day one, but as the reign of the Empire becomes more oppressive, and more of the galaxy realizes that they may have made a mistake welcoming the Empire into their lives, the number of rebellions fighting against the Empire would steadily grow. Some of it would be the existing rebellions gaining more steam, but a lot of it would be new rebel groups that maybe realize, hey, the Empire is not this force for good, they're not this force for order, at least not one that's a net benefit for the population, and standing up against Imperial reign. This would slowly snowball into the Rebel Alliance many years later, but for now, they're just scattered rebellions that work on their own. In fact, we see in Andor that one of the big threats that the Empire is starting to realize is that these rebel cells are coming together to form a single faction, and that's very threatening to the Empire, because while these rebel cells are scattered and fighting on their own, none of them stand a chance against the Imperial military, but were they all working together, there would be a much larger logistical network supporting rebel activities, and eventually theoretically, that kind of organization could pose a threat to the Empire, which it ultimately eventually does. Now, there's one last thing I want to throw out there, too, is like what happened to some of these Day 1 rebellions. We see a lot of Separatist holdouts seem to be snuffed out relatively quickly, and this is a byproduct of the Empire using Separatist holdouts as a scapegoat. They spend a lot of time pointing at Separatist holdouts as the sort of ultimate enemy that the Empire is built to fight, and as such, a lot of resources are put into quashing Separatist holdouts, even though some of them are obviously kept intact so the Empire can continue to have a boogeyman. A lot of them are crushed, and the ones that are kept intact are not very threatening. However, these rebel cells that were not directly connected to the Separatists received less publicity, they had less spotlight, and as such, they got less military attention, allowing them to flourish a little bit more, allowing them to have a bigger impact, and allowing many of them to survive all the way through to the rise of the Rebel Alliance to eventually join the Rebel Alliance, or at least work with them. So from day one, the Empire was dealing with rebellions across the galaxy, but they did manage to make the Separatist holdouts useful. If you'd like to learn about how the Empire really used the Separatist holdouts to their advantage, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think the Imperial officials, not the public, but the officials, people within the Imperial military, really understood that they were dealing with two kinds of rebellions, those that were formerly Separatists and those that were formerly Republic, or do you think they really just saw them as one unified group of dissidents? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.